Are the telepathy tapes real? So if you have heard of this show, it has topped all of the podcast charts. And what it's about are these autistic kids called spellers who display almost miraculous telepathic abilities to communicate with their parents usually, but also other autistic kids in ways that seems a lot like telepathy. And once this came out, Kai Dickens, who is the journalist who did the story, people fell into two camps. She went on Joe Rogan, and when you go on Joe Rogan, you get the whole pseudoscience sort of sphere of craziness, and then you get the reaction side that says anything that talks about things outside of mainstream scientific thinking is inherently bad. So I have read all of the critiques of the telepathy tapes, and I've listened to 7 out of 8 episodes of the telepathy tapes. And I want to give you my feeling about what's going on, because I don't actually... Well, I'm going to say some things that are controversial. So let me just summarize basically what Kai Dickens is saying. She presents herself as a skeptic to autistic people having telepathic powers, and then proceeds to do quite a few tests where the autistic kids, who are, she terms spellers, have essentially something like a Ouija board, and they, in various ways, communicate their thoughts by spelling. And this could also be, I think it might also be typed, and with sort of cues directly with their parents, wherein, she'll have a card over here, and the kid will guess what's on the card. And it is pretty convincing. And part of the reason why it's so convincing is it starts with sort of a very small inquiry into these claims of telepathy. And she is a skeptic, and she's trying to produce pretty controlled experiments. And listening to her, I believe that she is doing an honest job. I don't think she's out here trying to pull one over on the audience. At least I don't think so. But as the show progresses through the episodes, the telepathic powers of the kids aren't just guessing cards. It's also potentially seeing through their handler, their parents' eyes, or their teacher's eyes, communicating with words telepathically. So they just think words, and words show up in, say, a teacher's mind. And then all of the kids meeting on a place called The Hill, where they discuss big ideas and learn Spanish and learn other languages and make these truly extraordinary claims that, as I understand it in the last episode, you're almost talking about an afterlife, heaven. All of that is coming through these non-speakers. And the idea, how you support this idea is, and I think there's something to this. If you think about a blind person, their hearing gets better and they can navigate through the world using their other senses because their other senses get heightened. And with an autistic person who is non-speaking, the idea is they become very, very sensitive to other cues, and that is where these telepathic powers come from. That's sort of the theory, at least that Kai Dickens and the various scientists and researchers that she talks about, posit. On the other side of this, when this came out, there's a huge skeptical community that said, wait, look, the way that these tests were performed is something called facilitated communication, where the handler is actually giving cues, either intentionally or probably unintentionally, cueing the speller to respond in ways that are not verbal, and that produce these what appears to be telepathy, but is actually sort of like a magic trick. There's also a method called rapid prompting, which is related. And these methods have been pretty roundly rejected in the scientific literature, right? This is what the critics say, is we have tested facilitated communication, and when you properly blind the trials, and you properly blind the subjects, it appears that the translator actually sort of either unconsciously invents the answers or is giving cues to the autistic child to produce the desired responses. And so these are and there's one third camp. There's the group of magicians who come in here, and particularly mentalists, whose whole living, their whole career is based on making people believe that they are telepathic by setting sort of like magical prompts, using psychological tricks to make it seem like they are reading someone's minds when they're actually just not. It's a trick, and they admit the trick. So there's people like Brian Cox who have come out and said, no, I recognize that what is going on in this documentary series is just stuff that I would do on stage, and so therefore it's all bunk. And then there's the people who sort of understand the autistic literature and say, look, this whole idea of facilitated communication makes people believe that there's something real here, but when you actually boil it down, it's mostly just false hope. Okay, so those are the two different camps, and I want to give you my take on what this is actually all about. I personally think that there is more to conscious than straight material reality, right? We have never found a neuroscientist who's been able to look through all of the way the nerve firings are connected to find an emotion or poke a thought. The difference between the mind and body is and remains spooky and still unknowable. So I believe that anyone who says that materialism is the only way to understand consciousness is, well, they're not being 100% honest with the lacuna, with the empty spots, the gaps in what materialism can actually tell us about consciousness. And furthermore, I do think that it is possible that we have, that consciousness could be a field. It could be, I think I broadly fit into this idea of panpsychism, where consciousness is maybe a fundamental aspect of the universe writ large that we do not totally understand, where maybe everything is somehow connected with something like thought, something like intention, and maybe even choice. However, I also think that it's really important to understand where my belief in panpsychism runs up against the hard realities of science. And my statement, my approach to all of this is to say, you can have a belief of pretty much anything, and it just needs to be constrained by what we can identify scientifically. So once you have evidence and you build up models, your belief model, which is going to be bigger than the science, still needs to cohere to whatever we can understand scientifically. I think that is a rational way to approach the world, because there are things that we do not know. And at the same time, there are things that we do know. Like, we know how gravity works. We know how electricity works. We know how electromagnetism works, mostly. Like, the gaps in what we don't understand about that are small. But the gaps that we know about consciousness, they're still pretty large. And I don't think it is inherently crazy to say somebody with a disability and with senses that are tamped down may be able to pick up on other cues that a fully abled person who relies on a different set of senses might not bother or even be able to sense. And before I talk about facilitated communication and the weirdness of it at all, I first want to talk about communication, like just normal voice, and to talk about how weird and spooky it actually is. Like, if I'm saying something in a room with my wife, and I say, "Hey, what's for dinner?" That it was vocalized using the lungs, my mouth, the shape of all this. It traveled through airwaves, through vibrations, which was then translated through her eardrum, and then in her brain, translate those physical signs into a meaningful conversation, which literally changed her brain matter and her consciousness because she has to receive that information. That is spooky and weird and awesome and miraculous, and we just look at it as like it's ordinary. But it is, it's honestly amazing. And it's materialistic. We can understand the mechanisms, but it is miraculous. So let's not forget that. And add to that, like, even right now, I'm talking to you. I'm sitting in my office in front of a teleprompter and my computer, and I've got my bookshelf back here, and I'm saying things in your past, my present, and that is being stored in the internet, and it's traveling through all the tubes, and I have just changed your brain matter whether you liked it or not. That is spooky and weird and miraculous and beautiful, and it's worth recognizing that facilitated communication is actually super interesting. Because if you listen to the telepathy tapes, it's not only the Ouija board that they're doing. There's also verbal responses from these kids. There's information that's shared between kids in different rooms. And it seems like there's actually a larger variety of tests that Kai Dixon is running that are not specifically refuted by either the magician camp or the facilitated communication camp. And I will also say, in addition to this, that facilitated communication, the reason why it supposedly works is because the person who's interpreting the messages from the kid is either giving subtle cues that no one else can pick up on but are truly materialistic and understandable to the kid, or they're just making it up. And I feel like if that's true, if these subtle cues that no one else can sense are actually happening, then maybe we should study how those cues get transmitted. Right, like how the cues actually happen. Obviously, if someone's spelling if it's just coming from the interpreter and they're just completely making up things whole cloth, that's one story. If there are other cues that are being moved between those people, even if they're very, very subtle, well, I think we should probably try to study what those cues are. But I don't think that any of the people, and this is just me giving them the benefit of the doubt, I don't think that Kai Dixon or any of these parents of autistic children are intentionally trying to scam the audience. I think they all truly believe that this is going on, and because they are presenting at least their honest interpretation of the events, I think that requires someone else going in and giving Kai Dixon another once-over with scientific scrutiny. Because the output of a podcast is not good enough to truly say that this is definitely proof of telepathy. Like, this needs to be studied by scientists who don't have sort of questionable records, and the psychologists that she interviews, like Diane Powell, have actually had their licenses suspended to practice as psychiatrists. And that is not great. Now, Diane Powell, in her defense, says it's because she came up with these insane-sounding claims of telepathy, and then the psychiatrists were like, no, we have to tamp that down. Telepathy definitely does exist, and they're not honestly engaging with it. On the other hand, if you actually look at the records, it says she has poor management of therapeutic boundaries. That was one of the causes. Incomplete chart notes, a disorganized approach to treatment, failure to respond to significant patient symptoms, and concern over her management of patient medications. Those were the actual cause for taking away her psychiatry license. Now, it could be that it's a conspiracy by big psychiatry to not look into non-materialistic explanations. However, it should be pretty easy to test some of the claims about. For instance, the spellers supposedly say, several of them say, they meet at a telepathic place called the Hill, which is sort of like, heaven, consciousness, whatever, and they talk and they teach each other things like Spanish and world history and all this information that they couldn't otherwise get. And if this psychic space truly exists, then you could certainly find two of these autistic kids in two different places and tell one of them to communicate an idea to the other one and just straight up figure out if they are able to communicate through that strata. Now, that wasn't actually performed in the telepathy tapes. And I find like that experiment should be one of the first ones you do if you're going to say that such a space does exist. I also think that they should, if they make a claim like a kid who had no exposure to Spanish can suddenly speak Spanish, you should have them try to do that, right? It should be actually tested, actually presented. That should be a pretty easy thing to prove because they've said things like kids know Hindi out of nowhere. Great. we'll have them actually speaking Hindi, not just saying a couple numbers, which we don't know where they get from, to have them speak fluently. Either this is intentional duplicity by the autistic kids and Kai Dixon, or they are so confident that they are experiencing telepathy that they're sort of telegraphing it onto the kids, and the knowledge that they have of like world history or Spanish or whatever is completely coming from the interpreter and not from the kid. Well, it would seem that you could test that by talking to the kid with like other spellers, with another interpreter. It would seem that you could try to get a baseline for what their actual understandings are. And I'd also like to hear more from the kids themselves versus just doing things like showing an Uno card and guessing a number on that Uno card, which is a sort of a very small variable. Why aren't we actually looking at larger concepts, especially since Kai Dixon is saying that these kids are actually very, very smart and they're learning all sorts of things. I think she should have presented evidence of that overall. Now, to go back to the skeptics, however, I think that there's a lot of black and white thinking in the sort of materialist culture. And there's this feeling that you have to be on the right side of this absolutely immediately. You have to immediately castigate Kai Dixon as a sham in one way or another. You need to get the debunking crew to, without actually looking at the underlying evidence that Dixon has presented, just say, oh, you know how this works, because there has been clinical literature saying that facilitated communication doesn't work. Or you get a magician who says, hey, I can do the same thing. I could convince you that I'm a psychic when I'm not a psychic. I feel like that's not an entirely fair way to critique the telepathy tapes. And I'm going to give an example here. So I reached out to one of the debunkers, a guy named Jonathan Jerry, who wrote for McGill University's newsletter an article that called "The Telepathy Tapes Prove What We All Want to Believe," sort of the confirmation bias that we have. And I was like, hey, I want to talk to you about what it is that you do and your criticisms of the telepathy tapes. Maybe we can have like an interviewee conversation about it. And when I reached out to him over Blue Sky, his response was, hey, Scott, I saw your AG1 video and a criticism by so I did this video about AG1, and there was a New Zealand journalist crew who was also working on AG1, and they complained about my reporting, and we have sort of like a little bit of a journalistic misunderstanding between the two of us on exactly what happened. And he immediately said, hey, I listened to this, to the criticism of you, and therefore I think you're a bad journalist and I'm not going to talk to you. And I was like, hey, A, that's unfair because you didn't hear my side of this story, and B, it shows that you have very black and white thinking. Is that you have already assumed that something is wrong and something doesn't fit into your worldview. Therefore, it's not possible that something could be more complex and more nuanced than your immediately held beliefs. And so then when I look at his debunking piece on the telepathy tapes, I sort of feel like, well, maybe he's not giving her an honest take either. Because look, we know that consciousness is weird. We know that the mind-body connection has never been truly and formally analyzed so that this connection of neurons creates the sensational subjective experience in my body, and there's nothing more than that out there. That is a boring and also dishonest take on what consciousness is. I believe that we're all connected. I think that panpsychism, the idea that consciousness can exist writ large and in ways that are not perfectly described by materialism, I think we can say pretty securely that is true, that we don't know how consciousness works. So when someone debunking the telepathy tape says, no, we do know how consciousness works and you are necessarily a liar, I just don't feel like that's right. So, what's my overall take on the telepathy tapes is this. I think it's insufficient because I think that she takes small things like the guessing game on Uno cards or Ouija boards that could be confirmation bias. It could be, I guess, duplicitous lies and a magic trick that are just very convincingly placed. And I think that an independent entity, preferably by a disinterested scientist, can look at the same subjects that she talked to, and you could actually get an honest opinion. Maybe even bring in those magicians. For years, the Amazing Randy had a debunking thing where he debunked Uri Geller. He debunked all sorts of people who said that they had psychic powers. Bring in some of those people and get an independent audit of this. And the reason why that's important, and not just to throw this down and say, hey, there's no way this is real, is that the Telepathy Tapes is hugely popular. And a lot of people believe it, and she does a very convincing job in presenting her message. And she, I believe, is at least honestly believes the results of her work. Because it's so popular, it doesn't make sense just to naysay it and say there's no way it's true. Instead, bring some other people who also want to be popular to give an honest and objective, entertaining even, assessment of what's going on. I recorded this last night, and I did have one other thought that didn't complete this section, which is this. If she is truly honest, if this is a real phenomenon, it's something that could be repeated over and over again, she absolutely needs to share her underlying data and her contacts. When looking at her podcast, it doesn't look like she had a really great business plan when she put it together. There are no ad breaks put into the podcast in the places you would usually put ad breaks. It didn't really look like she was thinking about monetization, and that actually gives more credibility to her argument, at least in my estimation. However, if what we see coming forward is that she doesn't want to allow access to these spellers that she interviewed, she doesn't want to give her data, she doesn't want to fully cooperate with an independent assessment, well, maybe everything I said before this is wrong, and she's actually running a scam. So yeah, that is certainly in my head, because if this is a true fact of the universe, a universal field of consciousness energy, or something akin to that, then it should be repeatable by any lab and any researcher anywhere with a hard test. It's not like electricity works sometimes over here and not sometimes over there. So yes, that is a huge limiting factor, and I just want to see her stuff repeated. And that, I think, is what the world needs, because look, everything is not black and white. There are lots of questions, and she raises really good ones. For instance, she also talks about how pets and humans communicate with each other. Like, I know what my pets are thinking to some degree. That's usually food. But they communicate a wide variety of information, emotional cues, and I can read them and they can manipulate me. She talks about other scientists who've interviewed the relationship between African gray parrots and their owners. And there's some bizarre things in that I would actually like to know more about. Like how do dogs know their owners are coming home? I think it's worthwhile to play in those waters, even if ultimately there's a mundane explanation which is just materialistic and boring. I still think those questions are interesting, and they are not addressed by the magicians and the out-of-the-box skeptics who are just unwilling to be creative about this. And so that's my opinion. I'm sort of somewhere in the middle, and it's okay if you are too. From Pokebear LLC in Denver, Colorado, this was my back channel.